Survival horror is a genre that, at its best, makes players take risks against seemingly impossible odds. It limits ammunition for weapons, if there is any at all, uses sensory deprivation and disturbing enemy design to create imposing threats, and quite often it makes the game world a haunting, slowly trodden adventure that reveals a sinister nature behind it gradually. At its best, it faces ordinary people with something that it has built up but kept mysterious, and that is likely to tear them apart. A generally unspoken but integral idea that easily matches these obvious principles of survival horror, though, is that it needs to take risks to succeed just as much as its players do. But this is exactly what Amnesia: A Machine for Pigs is afraid of doing. The development history of frictional games, undoubtedly the masters of modern survival horror games, is full of streamlining, but often in a way that enhanced the games they made. For instance, Penumbra Overture featured chase sequences that had simple but not obvious solutions, and these sequences commonly led to players dying, then figuring out how to continue after a few deaths, then going on their merry way with the atmosphere of the scene sometimes diminished by their loss of immediacy. In response to this and other complaints, Frictional made improvements in Penumbra: Black Plague and the original Amnesia: The Dark Descent that would make immediate threats keep their immediacy, and would make player death a little bit more interesting. This kind of simplification is good in some cases, but what Frictional was able to accomplish was set very close to a fine line between keeping idiots from dying frivolously and making their game idiot-proof. Whereas the original Amnesia was a game that anticipated what you were thinking and designed and paced itself accordingly, A Machine for Pigs is a game that tries to do all the necessary thinking for you. I'm not sure if Frictional is still intent on making things more accessible for common gamers, or if the people at the Chinese room who developed A Machine for Pigs just believe everything they make should be a first-person movie, but nevertheless, the simplification of everything in the game is so pridefully on display that it severely impacts its pacing, atmosphere, and threats. The most iconic mechanics of a frictional-style horror game are still in place. Your character is a helpless Englishman who has to hide or run away from nearby enemies, but the game doesn't trust you with anything else. Now, Penumbra and Amnesia were mechanically quite simple in the first place, so it's important to illustrate by comparison just how low A Machine for Pigs stoops. Its predecessors were a mixture of fairly basic stealth encounters with simple point-and-click adventure-style puzzles, set in an environment that opened up linearly. The developers themselves remarked that the puzzles in these games were often in place just for the sake of having puzzles, regardless of how truly relevant they were to the narrative or immediate setting. But it's important to ask why they were compelled to add in puzzles. Figuring out how to turn on a generator or mix chemicals into an acid didn't really have anything to do with the unfolding stories of the Shelter or Castle Brennenburg, but what they did was pace the games, let the atmosphere soak in through exploration and examination, and not treat you like a fucking wimp. The puzzles and exploration elements weren't extremely consonant with what was happening story-wise, but they were purposeful and thematically appropriate. In Pigs, on the other hand, any of that reliance on player agency is discarded in favor of a completely railroaded experience. The developers don't do the smart thing and change up the gameplay formula to something that they think is better suited for a survival horror game. They remove most of the formula altogether. The entirety of the game has you going down what is fundamentally one long corridor, and to continue going down that corridor, sometimes you have to push a button or pull a lever. On rare occasions, it offers the illusion of branching paths, but they're short and they just lead straight to mandatory sub-objectives anyway. It doesn't make any attempt to hide this extremely funneled linearity either. In the first level, which is your large, open-looking mansion, every door or bureau or desk that you aren't supposed to bother with is arbitrarily sealed by an ornate-looking lock mechanism. The correct way to go is the only way you can go, and this stays true for the rest of the game. On some occasions, the narrative continuation buttons you press even close off access to earlier parts of the level for no discernible reason as they open the next segment of corridor you have to go down. This extreme restriction in the level design makes navigating a mundane task. Part of the success of Frictional's previous games at creating a foreboding atmosphere was a result of the uncertainty they instilled, because they didn't just present your objective in front of you and tell you to activate it. You had to search for important items or inspect the environment, or even wander around before your objective became clear, and this kind of presentation lent itself to a lot of build-up and foreshadowing that made each subsequent door you opened that little bit more intimidating. When there's only one way to go, on the other hand, there's no incentive to examine the environment with anything more than a passing glance, and there's no way to lose yourself in the game world. All of the elements that are supposed to be frightening take a big hit because of how obviously and transparently the game just shuffles you through them. Also noticeably no longer present is any management of your faculties. The original Amnesia had you dealing with your mental health and lamp oil in a way that added depth to how it played with light and darkness, as well as exposure to your enemies. In Pigs, there is no sort of passive mechanic like that, whether recycled or new. And as a result, the survival half of the phrase survival horror is much less relevant. Enemy encounters are the only actual threat you face, and they are fairly well spread apart. Everything in between is dead air. When enemy encounters do occur, things get a bit more interesting than the tedium surrounding them, but not enough to really save the game from its extreme simplicity. In this aspect, the game makes good moves that have proven themselves effective in its predecessors, like forcing you into darkness, or some other state of unawareness, and keeping you defenseless against monsters. However, it rides on the coattails of Penumbra and Amnesia so much that a lot of the potentially scary moments are things that anybody who has played Penumbra and Amnesia will have seen before. Apart from events that are stupid in their own right, like visions of children running around corners, plenty of little atmosphere-building events also make the same mistake of clinging to what has already been done, right down to the disturbing contents of a certain desk. This is of course not an impactful criticism to everybody. I'm not making this review on the assumption that everybody watching has played Frictional's previous games, but in that case it is important to note that those games did the same things better than what A Machine for Pigs manages. In keeping with the game's ambition to treat you like a baby, most enemy encounters take place on a very small scale and aren't really so dangerous, and many of the enemies who actually pose a threat just disappear pretty quickly once they lose track of you. It's only in the final act that the game tries anything new with its monsters, and while it becomes much less predictable and much less safe feeling by the end, this is a 3-hour-long game. Anything truly great in it is very short-lived. The promotional material for Pigs makes note that it tells the darkest, most horrific tale ever told in a video game, and while that's definitely debatable, it certainly isn't afraid of telling a mature story about horrific acts of violence. It creates one major problem for itself, though, that nullifies a lot of the impact it could have had. I'm about to deal a piece of criticism that unintentionally doubles as a potentially major mystery-ruining spoiler to anybody who remembers the story of Amnesia: The Dark Descent, and that's that it tells basically the same story. It's like going from System Shock 2 to BioShock. The Chinese Room took fundamentally the same narrative and passed it through the filter of a different setting. They do manage to refine it into something that's better than the original overall, but anybody who remembers the events and the world of the original game will have seen much of it before. It isn't until a defining scene 2/3 of the way through that the story really starts to adopt its own identity. When it does, it doesn't quite twist things up enough, but it manages to use its setting and historical context in an actually fantastic way. It would make sense to include similarities to its predecessor. After all, it's called Amnesia. But with horror, it's very important to design something that your audience is unfamiliar with. This is especially true with a game that relies on a mystery and profound twists. After all, it's called Amnesia. Aesthetically, Pigs is a mixed bag that's full of beautifully crafted assets that it doesn't really put to good use. The environments and all the sounds are some of the best an indie studio has produced. Even though there's the bare minimum of an environment in the game, it's wonderful to look at and listen to. But not everything works out so well. Like its predecessors, the game focuses on the contrast between light and dark, especially when enemies are near. But it puts itself through some kind of awful grayish-blue color correction filter from the Twilight films that washes everything out. It makes darkness lighter and lightness darker overall, so environments that are supposed to be really dark or well lit just end up looking dull most of the time. Even areas that are supposed to be pitch black allow for a strange amount of visibility that totally defeats their purpose. Pigs likes to be loud, and all the sound assets facilitate that very well. All the environments sound fantastic, and occasionally the game even manages to make the squealing of a pig not sound silly. The game is almost too prideful in its sound design though, and it blows its load very early on. Like in any game developed by Frictional in-house, you won't get many images of corpses popping out of nowhere to the tune of 93 shrill violins, but Pig still decides to go for cheap, overbearing shock events fairly often in the form of loud noises. You'll hear the shuffling of feet in other rooms, certainly, and other little atmosphere-building sounds like that, but sometimes it just tiptoes behind you and claps its hands. It's immediately lazy, and it kills the atmosphere of the environment surrounding it when it happens. A Machine for Pigs pulls a lot of tricks that you don't see very often in horror games outside of what Frictional has developed, but it's way too safe to use them properly. If the fact that there are monsters in this game is what sells it to you, and people have settled for less, much less, then the fact that it's 3 hours of walking and pressing obvious buttons probably won't matter to you. But survival horror is about much more than just a reaction of what's set right in front of you at dinner. For anybody for whom horror signifies a work of passion on the part of its creators to make players disturbed and uncomfortable at all times and have them take impossible risks, Pigs is a pretty shell of the games it emulates, with all its innards scooped out.
Isn't it dangerous allowing this filthy discharge to collect so close to the core? Dear God, the stench! This fecal matter is the true product of the age.